So welcome to our second concurrent session of the morning. Today we're going to be hearing from Charlene Rowan and Carolyn Goard on the topic of transitioning from domestic violence to stability. The Alberta Rural Development Network in supporting this conference has brought together a number of speakers, and the Alberta Centre for Child, Family and Community Research is particularly interested in this issue as the Interagency Council for Homelessness has identified housing and homelessness related to domestic violence as one of the research priorities for the homelessness and housing research strategy for Alberta. So it is a topic of interest for many in Alberta. So I will let our speakers tell you about what they'll be talking about, but I'd like to just give them a brief introduction. So Charlene's experience includes 21 years working in the not-for-profit sector, combined 16 years providing supports both in direct service and management to people with disabilities, and 8 years as a volunteer member serving on Lloydminster Interval Home Society Board of Directors. With an interest and passion to end family violence in our communities, Charlene was excited to join the Lloydminster Interval Home Society team. For the first 3 years, she had the position of program coordinator, and for the past 2 years, she has held the role of the assistant executive director. Being an advocate for families is Charlene's drive to working in the not-for-profit sector, as well as being able to provide supportive services to help families and communities become strong and healthy. Her co-presenter is Carolyn, who has worked as a psychologist in Alberta since 1973. Her experience includes 25 years of clinical practice with children and families and 15 years managing not-for-profit agencies in the domestic violence sector. She served as an executive and board member for organizations including Calgary Family Services, the YWCA of Calgary, Resolve, Homefront, and the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters. She's currently the Director of Member Programs and Services for the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters, and she has a keen interest in action-based community research that informs and improves practice and has led and participated in many such projects over the last 15 years. So if we can give them a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Roxanne. And Charlene and I are truly privileged to be with you this morning representing women's shelters across the province, and particularly second stage shelters. Our presentation this morning will, first of all, highlight the role that Alberta women's shelters have played over the last 30 years in providing safe haven for women and children fleeing domestic violence, and often particularly in rural areas, meeting the safety and temporary housing needs of women experiencing homelessness for other reasons. We're also going to tell you about and share preliminary results of a collaborative action-based research project, now currently in phase 2, between ACWS and 12 second stage shelters in Alberta, entitled Transitioning from Domestic Violence to Stability. And my colleague Charlene will bring the rural shelter voice and experience to this presentation, representing the experience of Lloydminster Interval Home, which provides emergency and second stage shelter in Lloydminster and the surrounding area. So let me first tell you something about the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters. The Alberta Council of Women's Shelters represents the unified voice for 42 member sheltering organizations, all the way from Fort Chip in the north to Kainai in Standoff in the south. ACWS members provide and operate 51 residential programs that provide a diversity of services for victims of domestic violence and abuse and their children. In that, there are 38 emergency shelters, 12 second stage shelters, 2 progressive housing focused facilities, and several community housing initiatives, 3, I think, that come under the rubric of Housing First initiatives in Calgary and in Medicine Hat. All member organizations provide outreach services to women not in shelter and following up when they leave shelter. And in 2013 and 14, just to give you the scope of the numbers of women and children served, Shelters provided safe haven to 5,710 women and their 5,612 children, and turned away an astonishing 6,000, almost 17,000 women and children due to shelters being full. So, in summary, ACWS supports our member organizations by providing training, tools, and networking opportunities to share promising practices. We conduct action-based research to investigate primary prevention and intervention techniques. And this, the action-based research that we've been involved in over the last number of years is supported by the fact that all member organizations in ACWS are on a shared database. And we've endeavored collectively to develop that database and learn how to use it and have data begin to inform practice for the last 15 years. ACWS also generates public conversations about recognizing the signs of domestic violence, a victim's rights, and available programming in their community for families impacted by violence. And I'll now ask Charlene to come up and tell you something about the Lloydminster Interval Home.
Thanks, Carolyn. Thank you very much for having me here today and being able to present and kind of talk a little bit about what we're doing in the Lloydminster area. Our Interval Home Society has been we're celebrating our 35th year this year of leading the way to ending family violence and homelessness. We provide services to women experiencing family violence and other life crisis. So our mandate is serving women with children, women fleeing family violence, and any other life crises such as homelessness as well. The City of Lloydminster, we provide has a population of approximately 30,000 people, and the surrounding area that we serve is about a 150-kilometer radius, which includes several Aboriginal communities such as the Onion Lake, the Thunderchild, and the Frog Lake Métis situation. We're quite unique that we're on the border of Alberta and Saskatchewan, so that poses a few challenges for us and the city in total, more so with our operating costs, but also our clients trying to navigate the two systems, both either on Saskatchewan or Alberta. So our purpose, vision, and philosophy values are to provide safety, support, and education to families and communities regarding the issue of family violence. And our vision really is to passionately work towards eradicating family violence. With those philosophy and values, we believe that our core values include that integrity, honesty, equality, and respect. So as I mentioned, we've been in the community now for 35 years. We started off as an emergency shelter, and we've grown into now a 21-bed facility supporting women and children. And since 2001, we now have our second stage facility, which is a 5-unit apartment building that we have for providing long-term service residential care support for up to 1 year. We also believe in being proactive and providing education and awareness to our community and surrounding area about what family violence is and how that impacts our community. So we have our public education program. We have community program where we offer not only programming to the women who are coming to the shelter and our second stage, but also programming to the community in general. So a lot of times we're providing programs within the schools. And also we have a men's program and a women's program that we have throughout the year, because we believe that it's not just a women's issue, this is a family issue and a community issue. To help kind of support some of the programs and our second stage, we have a social enterprise, which is called our For the Interval Store. And what that does is we receive community donations, and any of those donations that we receive are first and foremost go to the women and children that are in need. So if we have a woman coming to our shelter and is needing some personal items like clothing, household goods, whatever they need, they can actually go to our store and receive those for free. And for women who are moving out onto their own, we can also put together packages for them, whether it be like household goods like pots and pans, linens, bedding, furniture, whatever. And any of those other items that are not being used currently for the women, we sell back to the community, and all those proceeds then are used as a fundraiser to go back to our community programs, our outreach, and our second stage facility. So what are second stage shelters? So second stage shelters are really a safe, longer-term, apartment-style supportive housing that bridge the transition between an emergency shelter and a woman's being able to live independently on her own in a safe environment. As Carolyn mentioned, there are 12 second stage shelters throughout Alberta. 5 are in urban areas, Calgary and Edmonton, and the other 7 are in towns or small cities throughout the province. 7 of those are run by sheltering organizations that also operate an emergency shelter, and we have 1 new second stage shelter scheduled to open in September up in Grand Prairie, and 3 more are in the planning stages in all towns and small cities. 1 is Red Deer, Rocky Mountain House, and High River. Second stage shelters charge a social assistance rates for rent and fundraise to meet operational funding requirements, and only 2 of those second stage shelters are actually receiving funding, so the rest have to fundraise and find other means to support the operation. The goal of second stage shelters is really to enable women and children to establish an independent and life-free style of violence. And part of that is doing core wraparound services that provide safe and secure accommodation and includes different domestic violence interventions to ensure their safety. We provide programs to support women and children to heal from the trauma that they will have received and endured during their time in living in that family situation. And they also receive life skills, educational programming to assist them to become more economically self-efficient, and support and advocacy in navigating the complexities of the legal system. And a lot of times, when they're coming from a shelter into the second stage, having the ability to be able to move into a place where they know that their shelter needs are going to be met, but also all of those other needs to really support them through. It's one less thing that they have to worry about and have that stress of knowing that that's being followed for them. We also support them with any immigration issues. We've had in Lloydminster, have had several ladies coming through with immigration issues, so we've been able to support them with that, and also any parenting and specialized children's programming. So we do a lot of that within house, but we also use the resources that we have in the community and connect the women to those resources, more so because we know that their time at the second stage, it could be potentially up to 1 year, so we want to make sure that they are being connected to the resources. Some facilities are up to 24-hour supports, where some may be just an 8-hour during the day throughout the week, Monday to Sunday. There's usually guidelines and expectations put in place for the families, mostly because with families staying there, we want to make sure that anyone that is living in a second stage is really feeling that safe and security and knowing that they can live part of that family violence, or live that free from family violence. So part of what's been happening with ACWS and the members of that council, we've been working on a second stage shelter project since August of 2013 and will be going till 2016. Those goals are, and we work, the project involves, like I said, ACWS and with the other 15 member organizations to collectively develop strategies that will promote common understanding and support for second stage shelters in Alberta. It has been designed to describe the work of second stage shelters so this can be understood and appropriately placed within the spectrum of domestic violence and housing services. The overall project goal is to establish a process for collective outcome measurements in Alberta, second stage shelters to support shelter efforts to improve those shelter services, secure core funding, and increase funding accountability. So there's 2 phases to the project. Phase 1 is currently been completed, which the following slides will be able to speak to the project results. The highlights of Phase 2 are now underway, and which are implementation and evaluation of goal attainment scale and development of acuity scale specific to domestic violence. Acuity assessment will support quantifying the complexity of needs of women and children in shelters experience. The project will support creating a culture of informed service delivery within each participating second stage shelters, and as shelters improve their capacity to collect, analyze, and report data, they will better understand the needs of women and children in their shelters, informing the provision of more responsive and informed services. With that knowledge, shelters can then increase being more effectively advocating for those needed community services as women leave the shelter. The results will position second stage shelters, within the spectrum of homelessness service provision and demonstrate the important role that they play in housing women and children leaving domestic violence. It'll support developing a clear, convincing rationale for the need and benefits of safe, supportive housing for women and children leaving abusive relationships, ultimately resulting in access to long-term and sustainable funding supports. And I'll let Carolyn come up and she will speak to the phase 1 outcomes from the first phase.
Thanks very much, Charlene. One of the things that, that you mentioned is that only 2 of the current operational second stage shelters receive government funding. And we joke, sort of, within our network and beyond, that they have been pilot projects in Alberta for the last 30 years. They were funded when one of the roles that ACWS has had and why we were founded by the 9 members in 1983 at the time was we thought that we were stronger together. And one of the first successes that we had as a collective in that way was to garner funding through provincial government in about 1986 for the operational emergency shelters at that time. And since then, we went from a membership of 9 to now 38 emergency shelters. So you can see that that we have shelters that have tremendously increased the capacity across the province. And funding has been associated, not 100% funding for emergency shelters, but significant funding that has enabled those shelters to not have to spend an enormous amount, as much of an effort in terms of fundraising as their second stage sisters. Only at the time that the emergency shelters were funded in about 1986, 2 of the second stage shelters, the only 2 that were operational actually, Wings in Edmonton and Discovery House in Calgary, received program funding. So we've been on a march for the last 30 years to garner funding as more second stage shelters have come on stream, because we know they work. And as we've become more sophisticated in terms of data collection and data informing practice, and become more accountable in terms of reporting on the efficacy of programming, we're in a better position now to be able to bring data to bear to garner more support for that advocacy quest. So phase 1, that's what this project really was about. I guess I would say also that the only reason that that shelters or any other not-for-profit would endeavor to use their valuable time to collect data and so forth is because, bottom line, we as other not-for-profits want to improve service to women and children and to those people that are being served. So that's bottom line why we do it, but it also then really helps us to advocate for what services women and children need. So the first slide in terms of the outcomes of phase 1, we started by completing a literature review, which then informed the development of a logic model, a common logic model measurement tool for all second stage shelters. The first slide speaks to the need for second stage supportive housing. Research over the past decade has documented the changing demographic profile of Canada's homeless population, which is increasingly comprised of women, families, youth, and children, often referred to as the new or hidden homeless. Domestic violence is one of the main causes of homelessness among Canadian families, and women make up about a quarter of the homeless population. 63% of homeless women have been victims of domestic violence as adults. A critical time for women is when they have completed their stay at the emergency shelter and have decided not to return to their abusive relationship. This is a time when women are at risk for increased femicide. In addition, they are often isolated, have no money, no job or training, are still healing from abuse, have children to care for, have countless legal and bureaucratic hoops to jump through with limited or no appropriate housing options. The following slides specifically address the unique needs of women and children fleeing domestic violence that are supported through second stage housing. This slide speaks to the high risk that all women accessing women's shelters, whether it be emergency or second stage in Alberta, are at in terms of being killed by their intimate partners. A research study that we completed, which this slide represents, in 2009, in collaboration with 9 Alberta shelters, with Dr. Jackie Campbell, who is the author of she's from Johns Hopkins University, and she has spent the last 30 years or more of her life developing the danger assessment tool and essentially teaching people around the world to use it. So we were very fortunate to meet Jackie early in I believe about 2001. And in 2006, we undertook this research project with nine shelters and demonstrated that 74% of women accessing women's shelters in Alberta, emergency and second stage, scored in the serious to severe range with respect to their level of danger. So shelters are not spas, which we've heard over the years in terms of their being referred to. And so if you see the items on the left-hand column are items from, truncated items from the actual danger assessment. So you can see that in both emergency and second stage, women are at serious risk. But you can also see by just looking at the 2 columns, emergency and second stage, that there's a significant difference between the levels of risk that women accessing second stage and emergency have. So if you just look at physical violence increase, number 1, so the comparator there is 66% versus 85% in second stage. And if you look at number 13, control your daily activities, 78% versus 94% in second stage. And if you look further, threaten to harm your children, and this is often one of the reasons that women finally choose to go to shelter, is that their children are at serious risk. So you can see the difference, 18% to 65% in second stage. And then, do you believe that he is capable of killing you? A very important question. And we know that the one thing that we know after years of experience is that if a woman answers yes to that, it's important to listen to her. So you can see the difference there is 59% to 88% in second stage. So our goal in this project is really to better discern which women require second stage housing versus housing with wraparound supports in the community. One of the things that we do know is that all women at serious risk don't necessarily need second stage. Many do, but what we're really on a quest to determine is to better be able to discern which woman needs which kind of a placement, whether it's in community, second stage, emergency, or some other arrangement. And the one thing that we are absolutely sure of is that the risk for femicide needs to be one of the criteria informing any housing placement. This slide speaks to a history of trauma, which Charlene referred to when she was talking about the services, describing the services that Lloydminster Interval Home provides. And it speaks to a study that's called the SHIFT study, which is out of the States. And it was it examined the effectiveness of different housing and service needs in helping families who are experiencing homelessness establish and maintain residential stability and self-sufficiency. The interesting thing about this study was that it was the first one to find that trauma impacts a family's ability to maintain residential stability. And what the study suggests is that the cornerstone to any approach addressing family homelessness must address the impact of trauma and maternal mental health in order to support women's children's success. Women often face serious physical and mental health issues as a result of the trauma that they've experienced in the context of their intimate relationships. For women under the age of 45 years, intimate partner violence has a greater impact on health than any other risk factors, including obesity, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and illicit drug use. 74.5% of women fleeing IPV in another study had a chronic illness or disability, which in 48.1% of cases limited the woman's activities and in 40.3% limited employability. Depression, anxiety, and stress, as well as addiction and more serious mental health issues, compromise women's ability to keep themselves and their children safe and to establish lives free of violence. So, exposure to intimate partner violence has a traumatic impact also on children, especially the very young, who are more vulnerable given the rapid brain development that occurs in this stage of life. And when you consider that the majority of women in second stage shelters have children, and in 2012 and 13, 5,487 children were sheltered in Alberta women's shelters. 367 during that period were in second stage shelter, and 2/3 of children accessing shelter are under the age of 6. And I think about 45% of children are under the age of 3. So you can see that shelters potentially have and are playing a tremendous role in terms of prevention for the next generations. "70% of children who witness women abuse are physically abused themselves. Moms coming into shelter are traumatized, and many are parenting children also who have serious health and mental health concerns." We recently did another action-based research project entitled the Children's Project, which found that mother stress related to parenting is higher for women in second stage shelters compared to those in emergency shelter. And if you think about the levels of danger that were identified in a previous slide, that sort of makes sense, or it does make sense. So 1/3 or more of the urban violence against women population is immigrant or refugee women and their children, and this is most predominant in the large urban centres in Alberta. Having said that, there's been particularly in some of the rural communities, there has been a dramatic increase in immigrants coming from other countries. I'm thinking particularly of Brooks, who have folks coming in from to work in the meat processing industry. And what we know is that new immigrants face multiple challenges, including poverty, language acculturation, exploitation, isolation, lack of informal supports, sexism and racism, custody and legal issues. I was talking with one of our colleagues in Brooks the other day, and she was speaking about the fact that many of the women that come to shelter in Brooks are from other countries as well. A vast majority of them are not literate in their own language, their language of origin. Excuse me, I apologize, I have a cold. And nor would they then be literate in English. So the supports that shelters provide in assisting women to manage the very complex systems that they need to is invaluable. And immigrant women, for all of those reasons, may stay in abusive situations when their abusers control them by exploiting their lack of awareness of personal rights and the law, such as threatening loss of child custody. We hear that all the time. The abusive partner or family member may be in control of a woman's immigration status by being her sponsor and can use this as a way to exert control and keep her from leaving a violent relationship. Her immigration status may affect her ability to seek and obtain government assistance. We've had many women in shelter who are not able to access any of the supports that our government provides because they don't qualify. And that really hinders any attempt to leave and further increases their economic dependence on their abuser. And it also prevents women from accessing police and criminal justice system services due to fears of deportation or racism. Violence, poverty, and housing is endemic to all of what we're talking about here. The findings of the SHIFT study referenced earlier suggest that without an integrated response of emergency and second stage housing, that many women's chances of escaping from violence and abuse are greatly reduced. And the risk of incidences of repeat and prolonged periods of homelessness is greatly increased. The ACWS exit survey data from that small study that we did in 2007 to 8 states that 57% of women who stayed in emergency shelter in the past returned to the same relationship, citing the following reasons for return. Lack of affordable housing, well, that hasn't changed at all, it's just got worse. It's just become worse. Lack of money and fear. And access to affordable housing is particularly problematic in rural communities and small towns. Great. And I'll turn it over again to Charlene.
So one of the things, this next slide, are just some questions. We want people just to imagine if you would, a community where children are exposed to violence and abuse in their homes. Imagine a community where families experience violence and abuse in their everyday lives, and a community where women are fearful of not having a safe place for themselves or their children to go when needed. And when we speak to that, we speak to, I think, any community where there has been exposure to family violence. So we want people just to consider and think about the needs that we've had. And for, in Lloydminster, like I said, we've been there for 35 years. Where would those women have gone had they not had those opportunities to come and receive services? One of the data that we have shows that in emergency shelters for communities other than the 7 cities that Carolyn has spoke about, we received 5,482 admissions. And with that comes also some turnaways because we have only a certain amount of capacity to take women in. And for the turnaways, it was 4,312. So when you kind of look at those numbers, for every 2 women that are coming into a shelter, approximately 1.5 are not able to come in due to capacity. So the need for second stage facilities is quite high because we need to be able to support those women when they come into the shelter, also to have a place to go after. So again, some more questions, to the what if there was no emergency shelters? What if there was no second stage shelters? Where would people go for safety? Where would people go to find safe and affordable housing? And what if there was no services to support families to live free of violence? And the last question, speaking to the last slides, would some women die and would some children? And that's the reality that we have to face. And as though we don't want to make it sound horrible, but we do need to realize that that is the reality for women who are escaping those situations. In the Lloydminster, over the past year, we had approximately 800 plus people who requested admission into our shelter. And we often wonder, where would they go or what would they do if they didn't receive that support, not only during a crisis, which the emergency shelter supports, but what about the after? Where do they go when they don't have a place to go back to, or they are forced to go back to, as Carolyn had mentioned, because the lack of affordable housing or the fact that potentially they had financial abuse in their situation and have no money to even be able to go out and look for a safe place for themselves. So for us, the second stage facility has played an enormous role in being able to support those women in our community. And although we only have 5 units, we're just now starting to look at turn away data into our second stage, which I'll be able to talk to here in a little bit. So looking at these questions, we need to really be mindful of what sorts of long-term solutions that we can have for our families and also our communities. So right in Lloydminster, there's about 5 housing options that we have. We have our housing authority, and being on the border, of course, we have both Alberta and Saskatchewan low-income housing, Métis housing, and one called Carlton Housing, which is a property owned by a local native band. We also have rental properties like any other community, I'm sure, which have apartments, private houses, private basement suites, and room and board. But we're finding that these options, especially through our housing authority, are very difficult to get into for our women. Right now, in speaking to our to the shelter frontline coordinator, she said that right now women, when they're applying for these housing, are being told that they can be anywhere from 6 months up to 2 years. And with the recent economic turndown, what was happening is people are not leaving these different housing units, so it's getting to be more and more difficult for these women to be able to even be able to get into. And the other piece about being on the border is that clients can apply for either side, but again, that creates a little bit of a challenge, because if they're needing to change residency from one province to the other, depending on what their current status is, it depends on, you know, being able to change from becoming an Alberta resident to a Saskatchewan or vice versa. So there's a lot of barriers for the women who are coming into the shelter being able to find anything through a housing authority. And then the other side of, with the rental properties, the barriers there are really on the prices of what a 2-bedroom or whatever type of apartment unit that they're looking for. They have the limitations on obviously financial reasons, but if they've been living with their partner and have no credit rating, then being able to provide references or anything like that, or needs a co-signer, those are also barriers that they are being faced with. And also, and I'm sure most of you know, just even the assistance that they get is very limited for what they can pay for a rental. So for a woman that may only get $600 or $700 for rent, for financial assistance, as you can see, just even now a 2-bedroom, and this is on the low end, $1,000. Some have been up to $1,500. How does she even make that affordable for herself? Oh, I believe this is now Carolyn's. Sorry.
Thanks, Charlene. So one of the things that I think that it's important to stress is that the women that generally are in women's shelters are at or below the poverty line in terms of their income. The majority are on fixed incomes in terms of income support or AISH or other limited part-time incomes. And some of these women have left relative middle-class families, and we know from research that's been done that when women leave an abusive situation, they may have been living in a relative economic security, and when they leave, they no longer have that economic security. And when we talk about affordable housing in Alberta today, the women that are in women's shelters cannot afford that affordable housing. So it's a huge issue, and I know that there are lots of very innovative community actions happening in Lloydminster and other communities across the province that women's shelters are involved in that are pretty exciting. So this slide represents another outcome of the first phase of the project, the research project that we've been involved in. And it's a pretty complicated slide. It's actually a summary of about 6 pages of detail that speaks to a collaborative process that shelters undertook as we worked through what all of the shelters participating, and there were 12 shelters, could agree to and would work in their unique contexts as far as what their goals were, what they were all bringing to the work that they were doing, and really describing components of shelter work, especially the desired outcomes. And it provided developing the logic model, which was very much grounded in the literature review that was done, or that was completed, because we did that first, really provided some direction for the parameters of the second stage shelter data collection, which I'll speak to in a minute, the data collection results, including data collection tools and methods. And so this is at the end of the first phase. We're now into the second phase. And based on what we found and what we agreed to in the first phase, in the second phase, we're moving the work further along. So what were the results in terms of the data analysis? 77% of women identified at least one type of abuse that they experienced immediately prior to their admission to the shelter. In most instances, women identified multiple forms of abuse, including verbal, emotional, or psychological abuse. 95% of those who identified at least one form of abuse, followed by physical abuse, 81%, and financial abuse, 68%. A really important finding, and it also relates to the danger assessment results, or connects to the danger assessment results, is that women in second stage shelters are more likely to experience physical abuse than women in emergency shelters. 81% compared to slightly over 70% of women in emergency shelters. And this slide just confirms the earlier one, which was the first study that we did on utilization of the danger assessment. And the second stage project, as well as other projects that we've done in the ensuing years, all confirms those earlier results, that women in second stage shelters are at higher risk for femicide than women in emergency shelters. And as shown in the figure, almost 2/3 of the women in the second stage shelters in this particular time period are in extreme danger of femicide, and an additional 13% were in severe danger. By comparison, during that same time period, because we also aggregate data on a yearly basis, and we're beginning to aggregate on an ongoing basis results of the danger assessment that shelters are utilizing. By comparison, during that time period, 52% of women in emergency shelters were in extreme danger, 22% in severe danger, and the remaining 26 either in increased or variable danger. So over the course of 9 months, second stage shelters recorded 354 admissions and 224 discharges. There were 571 children then that accompanied their moms. The majority of women discharged chose to leave the shelter. A small number were asked to leave, 14%, and the reason for the other 7% of women leaving were unknown, often because they left without contacting shelter staff. Women who choose to leave the shelter often did so because they completed the program, reached the expected length of service, or moved to a different city or found housing. And of those women who chose to leave, a large majority, 70%, identified that they completed the program and met their goals. And women who were asked to leave were usually unable to meet shelter policy requirements. There were concerns for safety of other residents, intoxication on site, or non-payment of rent, or the agency wasn't able to accommodate the woman's needs. One of the things that we haven't said is that generally second stage shelters, and emergency shelters for that matter, shelters women's shelters don't run harm reduction programs. And however, there's a great tolerance, generally speaking, in shelters for somebody doesn't get kicked out just because they come home and they've been drinking, or they come back to shelter and they've been drinking. It's only if the resident that is intoxicated is putting other residents or themselves at risk that they would be asked to leave, generally speaking, in shelters across the province. And especially in second stage, where women and children are living for 6 months to a year or more, they're in one large building, and there are some shared spaces. And so it's really important, critical actually, that the women and children feel safe. At the time of discharge, about half of the women were going to live on their own, with or without their children. Others were going to live with family or friends, returning to the abuser, about 5%, and one woman was going to live with her new partner. The remaining women were either unsure or their living situation at discharge was not specified, 25%. And upon their discharge from shelter, over half of the women were planning to live in stable housing, 53%, and the housing situation for other women was either temporary or unknown. And by comparison, if you recall the small study that I mentioned, referenced in a previous slide, that we did in 2007 to 8, over half of the women in emergency shelters returned to the abusive partner. So you can see just by that kind of gross comparator that the second stage shelters are showing good results in terms of women moving on, in terms of living, having support to leave their abusive partners should they wish to. In terms of the next phase of the project, one of the things that we agreed in the first phase that we thought it important to do was to implement a goal attainment scale, which we developed in phase 1. So that's very exciting, because that will give us opportunity, both from the woman's perspective as well as from the staff perspective, to really evaluate whether women are meeting the goals that they set for themselves. And there's a whole list of goals. Certainly the primary ones are safety, housing, education, parenting. But women can, it's a very flexible system that each woman is unique, and within the kind of that broad framework, she can set her own goals, and then there's a process that has been established, a standardized process that all the shelters are using, and that is very exciting. The other thing that we're planning to do is to develop and implement an acuity scale, because we know, as I'm sure everybody in the room knows and understands, that the complexity of issues that women face coming out of a domestic violence situation it's really complex, and we've become much more sophisticated in understanding who the women are that we're serving, but we think we can do an even better job of that in terms of developing a domestic violence specific acuity scale that will essentially weight characteristics, or women's characteristics that they identify as they come into shelter, and that will help us just better speak to those complexity of issues in terms of advocating on women's behalf, advocating on shelters' behalf for services that are needed.
So just to kind of wrap up a little bit about what the second stage shelters in rural communities, and asking why. It is a real issue in our community, and as I mentioned before, last year we had 800 women and children that tried to access the interval home, and we had to turn away about 400 of those individuals, and most of those were children. One of the things we find is that second stage shelters is not only providing a housing, obviously for women and children, but just what they can gain from being able to stay and gain those supports. I think of a client in the last few years. She came to the shelter on a couple different occasions, and she came to us on the second time and was really ready to make a change in her life, and realized that for her young daughter, who I believe was just 3 at the time, realized that in order for her daughter to grow up and, you know, have a healthy lifestyle, she was ready to make those changes and inquired about our second stage. And fortunately, at that time, we did have a unit available. And it was amazing to watch her change in her process. When she first came, you know, she would literally break down crying at any little moment, and she would be talking about, I don't understand why I'm crying so much. And we would say to her, you're healing. Like, you've been through a traumatic event. We're here now to support you. You're going through this, and you've taken that step, and you're taking the courage to make that break, not only for yourself, but for your daughter. And in that time that she was there, it was amazing to watch her grow and just gaining the confidence in herself. One of the things that she did was to help her relieve some of her stresses, that she made jewelry. And when the staff realized that she was doing this, talked to her and said, would you be interested in selling that back out in the community? And she didn't think that anybody would ever be interested in buying her jewelry. And so luckily her worker connected her with another business in town that, you know, really supported people in the creative sense of art and whatnot. And when they seen her work, they absolutely fell in love with it and said, can you get us some more? And gave her a spot in the restaurant where they could sell it. And from there, once she started realizing, I can actually contribute back to the community and look at what I'm doing, she's just grown and flourished. She's now living on her own, and I believe she stayed in the second stage for up to 9 months. But from that time when she first started, never believing that anybody could ever, you know, that she could never do anything more than what she was at, she's now, you know, looking after herself. She's going back to school. She's really becoming a contributing member to our community, and really become strong and confident in herself, and believing that where she was living doesn't have to be her reality. Her reality is now that she's a strong, independent woman, and showing her daughter how to be that strong, independent person that she can be growing up. So those are, you know, that's just one story of many that we see, you know, at the shelter and over at our second stage facility. Any little success that a woman can walk away with, we find is such a positive thing. Each step that they take to making themselves become independent, strong, and healthy is what we need to help get our communities healthy and back on being productive. So when we talk about second stage being a housing support to families, really sometimes that is the only option that they have because of the complex needs that they have, and being able to not only overcome some of those fears of where they are, but also to give them those supports along with the housing. In Lloydminster, we often talk about ourselves, we're too big to be small and too small to be big. So there's lots of challenges for the supports that we have in our community of being able to provide to the women. We have no transportation, so as we're growing, we're finding that it's getting more and more difficult for these women to be able to access services, so we support them the best we can. So. And in our hopes and dreams is that we need more long-term spaces, outreach, and education for families. So as we're growing as a community, we're also looking at the shelter as also growing, potentially expanding our services both through emergency services, second stage, and potentially maybe a third stage housing as well. But those are our hopes and dreams. So as our community grows, that's what we're also hoping for. And I'll let Carolyn now wrap up her time. Oops, sorry.
Thanks, Charlene. Just to build on what Charlene has been saying, those hopes and dreams of Lloydminster Interville Home are shared by the hopes and are shared dreams by all of the shelters in Alberta. and particularly those in the rural area. And I know that one of our colleagues, two of our colleagues actually from High River are here, and I know that they are working very diligently to forward their dream in terms of developing a new emergency shelter in conjunction with a second stage shelter. And doing some other fabulous work in terms of community work, working together and really building synergies with others in the community to meet the needs of women and children, but also more broadly the community as it relates to homelessness. So just a couple of last comments. I highlighted Jeanette Wagemaker's Shifts and Alina Turner's article or piece, research piece that they did actually for the Alberta Centre. It's an excellent document if you haven't had a chance to look at it. And the one thing that caught my eye in particular is that they say that the development of intervention and prevention efforts to address domestic violence in rural Alberta should be undertaken in tandem with homelessness responses, and I don't think there's any question about that at all. I think that from a shelter perspective, we've been doing that forever. Many of the women that have accessed shelter in rural shelters over the years have not been technically fleeing abuse in that moment. They've been women in other crises. And if you look deeper into once you begin to meet these women, of course they've experienced abuse, many of them domestic violence. So we have been doing that within the network for a long time and wish to continue doing that. And the other thing that this article, that the authors point out in this particular excerpt is that housing first adaptations for women and children fleeing violence require reconsiderations of safety guidelines, especially if implemented in rural areas. And so we, based on the presentation this morning, I'm sure you'll know that we certainly affirm that hugely. And I would also comment that that would be true in the urban areas as well. Safety is of paramount concern, and that's why we are really keen to develop the Acuity Index and to support the adaptation of tools currently used in the homelessness sector to support placement decisions. So we look forward to that work. And the second last thing is that the work that we're doing together is really wanting to position second stage supportive housing within the spectrum of services for homeless women, and that those shelters be funded appropriately. We've got 10 that are unfunded currently by government. We've got another 3 or 4 that are coming on stream in the next few years. We know that they're necessary, that they do work. And we also know that they're not the only answer. There needs to be a spectrum of services for the particular population and concerns that we're addressing today. And the bottom line is that we really want to ensure that homeless databases protect survivors' privacy, so that, for example, any intersection of all of the data, the wealth of data that the Alberta Council and shelters have accumulated over the past 10 or 15 years, that any intersection that protects survivors' privacy, safety and confidentiality are of paramount concern. So thank you for your attention. We really appreciate being here today. The full report of the project that we've been talking about is on the ACWS website. It's very simple, www.acws.ca. So thank you.